My name is Michael Daross. I'm a design technologist at HomeAway, which is a vacation rental marketplace company based here in Austin.
I'm Joie Chung, and I'm a designer at HomeAway.
So before we get started, if you guys will indulge me, a quick show of hands, just want to get a sense of the demographics here. How many of you are designers? Okay, developers? Okay, design technologists? Sweet. How many of you actually don't even know where you are right now? A little bit of pre-partying. The week is young, so pace yourselves. So when I tell people what I do, and people find out I'm a design technologist, the usual response is, oh, design technologist, cool, cool, cool. Wait, what is that? It's two words we all know. Seems like it should be a thing, but a lot of people haven't actually worked with one. So we're going to talk about what DTs do on a day-to-day basis, and then Joey's going to talk a little bit about her experience working with the DT as a designer. And then, since it's such a new practice and it's a really new job field entirely, we're going to talk about some strategies for finding DT talent and recruiting DTs. So first of all, what is a design technologist? Basically, we're developers who specialize in the craft of design implementation. And our goal is to raise the level of finesse of the design implementation. So is that motion tween using exactly the right easing? And is that SVG rendering with the same crispness across all of the devices we support? And we're also trying to raise the credibility of the design department within the organization by showing that the problems that the engineers are going to run into when they start implementing our designs are something that have been thought through in the design department. So we're not just chucking designs over the wall, we're actually on the ground helping you build them. You might have heard of this practice under a few different names at different companies. At HomeAway, the DTs are part of the design department. Some places, well, there's a couple that are engineering. And some places they're in engineering, some places they're in their own department. But what these companies all have in common is that they've realized the value of having people in their organization who are what I call bi-teamal. And yes, that is a made-up word. So we have 1 foot in design and 1 foot in engineering. And this engineering approach to solving design problems allows us to bridge a gap between these two departments that frequently have communication challenges. So here's just a quick concrete example. On the left here is the full spec for a card carousel component that we made. And you can see, you can't read it, that's intentional. It's pretty complicated. This is a zoomed in version of the card carousel relevant portion of the spec. It's a very thorough spec made by one of our designers. So here is the initial implementation as it was built by the engineering department. Here is what it was supposed to look like. The bottom example was built by one of our design technologists. Now, it's easy to look at that card carousel spec and be confused about what exactly the behavior is supposed to be. You can't really get that information very easily from looking at a flat mock. So this is just one of many small things that DTs can enable. And I'm going to get into a lot more examples later. So here's a quote that I like a lot from a guy named Joie who's a design technologist. He says, "We bring an engineer's pattern thinking to systematizing designs and a designer's eye for fit and finish and empathy for a user's needs. Aren't you glad I read that to you?" So what do DTs actually do? Well, primarily, we deliver specialization in what we refer to as a presentation layer, which is the topmost part of the UI, the part that users actually touch. So DTs are really passionate about craft. We care if the centered icon is actually off-center by a pixel or two. And we have to do that because good design that's implemented poorly is indistinguishable to the user from bad design, right? So if you want to know if your design is a good design, you have to really nail the implementation. It's our responsibility as design technologists to make sure that what ends up in the hands of users is a faithful representation of the design vision. If you don't know what this is, Google old lady fresco. You will not be disappointed. So why do you need DTs for this specifically? Why not just train your UI developers to have that level of craft? Well, the reason is even really top-notch engineering teams, like we have at HomeAway, don't automatically have the skills to achieve the level of polish that we need to see for the design to be vetted thoroughly. The developers are hired for their coding skills, okay? Whether they can write a secure authentication layer or a sort algorithm or whatever. They're not hired because of their eye for spacing or typography. It's not what they went to school for. And this leaves a gap between what the designers expect to be built and what the engineering team is able to actually do. An analogy here is something, a really hot trend lately, of course, is full stack development. Are there any full stack devs here? All right, you're buying drinks later, right? So the great thing about full stack devs in theory, and we're going to gloss over the kind of blurry line between front end and back end, is that full stack devs can write code across the stack, right? So the communication loss between the front end and the back end is the underlying cause of a lot of bugs in our apps, right? So theoretically, if someone can speak the same language and use the same frameworks across both parts of the application, you have less bugs. So you can think of design technologists as a similar concept, but further down the stack. This is a little chart to illustrate this. I know some people are going to quibble with some of the details of this. Every dev is different. But this is just to illustrate a point. So you might be thinking, well, don't full stack devs also know presentation layer coding? You know, it's CSS and HTML, presumably, right? And front-end devs, the front end includes the presentation layer, right? The thing is, with modern apps, as probably most of you know, the front end has become so vast and so complex that it's really just not realistic to expect any individual developer to be a specialist on every single part of that front end. Even if they have all those skills, and there are some people who do, there's a cost to switching contexts between working on the middleware and working on this presentation layer code. And if you keep switching contexts over and over again, eventually you become pretty inefficient, which kind of defeats the purpose of having a full stack dev, right? So for a startup, it's fine. You can have a full stack dev, someone who understands the entire stack from the database all the way through to the top level of the UI. But for an enterprise app that has millions of users, we have to rely on that old pillar of civilization, which is division of labor. Okay, so if you specialize in everything, you specialize in nothing. And if anybody saw Ta-Nehisi Coates earlier today, he was talking about this idea that you can go wide or you can go deep. And DTs are people who have chosen to go deep into this presentation layer part of development and into design. So that way the full stack and front-end devs can worry about the business logic and the services and the middleware, all the stuff that actually makes an application run. It's critical to recognize that this gap might exist on your team, or your UX department can't deliver on its potential. Which brings me to one of the next thing that DTs do, which is we refer to as design intake and design review. You can think of this as a kind of design filtration system. So raise your weird mechanical Dvorak keyboard if you're a dev. Anybody? So how many of you have ever gotten something from design and taken one look at it and realized immediately that it could never actually be built? And the designer is like,
Hey, so I was hoping the pop-up could come out and give the user a head massage so that we can relax them a little bit and so they can have a really good experience with our product.
Might present some challenges. And so then you're okay, you give your feedback back to the designer, and what then? They immediately turn around and say, oh sure, yeah, I'll have that revised design for you this afternoon, and it's not gonna have any problems with your existing implementations, and it's just gonna be plug and play. Or do they say,
What do you mean you can't build that? Our competitor has it. Their website fed me soup. It's great.
delicious. But what if that feedback that you were able to give the designer happened earlier in the process? What if you had somebody on the inside, so to speak, who knew the constraints of your security and your performance, and they could put the kibosh on ideas that are really expensive before they even leave the designer's desk? Because to borrow an old adage, ideas are cheap, implementation is expensive. And even really senior designers sometimes will come up with things that might be a great idea, but maybe they're too expensive to build right now, or we have, doesn't fit your design system. So DTs can work with designers throughout the design process and suggest comparable designs that still meet the same underlying user needs, right? But are maybe a little bit cheaper or fit more in with your existing implementation. Or we can build a proof of concept, and then you can sit with the designer and tweak it and see what will work. So next, raise your bespoke, upcycled leather messenger bag that you got off of Etsy if you're a designer. Anybody? So how many times have you ever asked a developer for something that you knew was possible because you had seen it before, and the developer was like,
So you want the text to have an underline when you hover? You mean like a whole line? I don't think that's possible.
not with today's technology, bro. But DTs can build a prototype of the interaction that the designer wants with the exact motion and interaction and layout, because it's really hard to say something's impossible if you have a working prototype in front of you. Likewise, how many of you designers have ever delivered something to your engineering department, and then when you got it back a few weeks later, it wasn't exactly what you were looking for? Now, sometimes it was a junior dev. Sometimes it wasn't a junior dev. It was just someone who doesn't really have an eye for design. And it's not a knock on the developers that they don't have that eye. It's not what they were hired to do. Sometimes they don't really even want to do that. So DTs can pair with devs for the part of the code base they don't specialize in, or they can, at HomeAway and some of the teams, we actually review pull requests, however you want to structure your process. And we call this part of the process the design review. Some people would refer to it as design QA. I personally don't really like that because it implies that the development is finished at that point. And it works a lot better if the design technologist can be involved earlier in the process.
And sometimes they actually did follow the specs, but the outcome is different. We often wonder why the implemented version is so different from our designs. Well, one of our DTs helped us identify differences in the way that Sketch and iOS render specs. He developed an open source app to help us explore the rendering differences between the two, and it's helped us a lot on how to adjust their specs so that they can render as close as possible to intended. So look at this example right here. I mean, you can see the shadows, the gradient, even the text spacing is different. And what we want to do is get as close to what we wanted in Sketch.
So the next thing that DTs can do is help you out with the design system. It's great to have DTs around for production code, but chances are you probably won't have that many of them, at least right now. So maybe the best bang for your DT dollar is in the design system, working on shared components, that kind of thing. And as I'm sure everyone is exhaustively aware, since like 50% of the talks here are about design systems reduce cognitive load for the user because of consistency, they improve aesthetics, and they make implementation easier. And they also free up designers from thinking about these atomic level interactions to allow them to focus on the bigger picture. Now, designers, of course, can create design systems. That's part of what they do for a living. But it's really great to have DTs involved in that process too, because DTs are used to thinking in terms of scalability and maintainability and parsimony. And that engineering mindset and experience, it really comes in handy when you're thinking through these use cases that are going to make up your robust design system. DTs have built components before. We've maintained code bases and fixed bugs and written tests. And we know what kind of problems the engineers are going to encounter when they start building our designs. We know what kind of documentation they expect to see. And we can build tools which help out with the process. And this is the next thing that DTs do. So developers spend a lot of time automating stuff, right? There's this old aphorism that one of the hallmarks of a good developer is laziness. Devs don't like repeating themselves. So we'd rather spend a bunch of time automating a boring task than do it by hand, even if doing it manually might actually take less time in the short term. Now, traditionally, that's not really as much of a designer thing. Designers do use symbols and templates and process improvements to try to be more efficient, but they don't typically write plugins or bash scripts to parse their data. You might be thinking, oh, actually, I know a designer who does that all the time. That's actually a great sign of a potential design technologist. So keep your eye out for those people. So in the interest of fairness, here is an example of some design system tooling from one of our main competitors, Airbnb. Has anybody seen this before, this tool? Yeah, so this is called React Sketch App, and what it does is it renders React components directly into Sketch. So you can pull in a live version of a component and build your designs around that. And if you want to see new data, different language, you just change the data source. And what they're really doing here is creating a single source of truth for their design system so that changes automatically propagate across all the sketch files. For a small company, that's a nice to have. For a big company, it becomes really important to have those efficiencies. And to build things like this, it's really helpful to have design technologists on your team who understand the design process and can build these tools, and because they also have the ability to build tools. I believe at Airbnb, they have a design tooling department. I'm not sure. So the next thing that DTs do is what I think most people think of when they think of design technology, prototyping. So complex modern designs, as you all know, can't really be understood from a static mock. If you want to get good feedback on your design, you need high-fidelity prototypes, because a lot of problems just aren't really obvious until you start building something. Here's an example where we have this modal dialog that has a button fixed to the bottom, okay? It's a fine idea, but on Android, when you open a keyboard to start typing into something, the keyboard actually cuts the viewport size in half. So that button that was fixed to the bottom is now on top of your dropdown, right? So this is the kind of thing that doesn't really come up until you start implementing something. Before we spend a whole bunch of time and money actually implementing production code, it's nice to have a prototype of this to find out these problems. At HomeAway, we actually have also built a user testing lab that has eye tracking and emotional response, facial response software, and it has these really gigantic orange chairs, which are designed to be comfortable because you're going to be sitting there for several hours at a time. You can also fit 3 people in them, which, if you're into that kind of thing, which is cool. So we also have these UX researchers who can walk the user through these really finely tuned sets of questions, and we can use that data to tune our experiences. And DTs enable this kind of research because we can build prototypes really quickly, and in fact, sometimes we'll make changes to a prototype in between user sessions on the same day. So the last thing I want to talk about that DTs do is design evangelism, or being advocates for design. One issue that designers frequently run into, especially if you have a relatively new design department, is establishing trust with the engineering department and the product. So it's fairly common that engineers look at designers as these kind of naive, technically illiterate unicorn people, right? And designers will frequently think of developers as these grumpy obstructionists who emerge from their caves periodically to crush your dreams and make you cry. Now, of course, there is some truth to both of those stereotypes, but obviously we'd like to minimize that dynamic as much as possible. And what DTs can do there is to humanize that conflict from both sides. I don't want to overemphasize the conflict part, but maybe there's a good reason why the designer wanted this component to animate in from the left. Maybe it was to preserve the mental model of the user from the previous state. It's not arbitrary, there's actually thought that went into it. And maybe The dev is complaining about making a one-off version of this component that doesn't match the rest of the system because they know that 6 months from now, it's going to be a maintenance nightmare to try to update that. So it's not that they're lazy, it's just that they're seeing things from a different point of view. DTs, by the nature of what we do, have kind of a sense of both of those perspectives, and so we can help bridge that gap.
All right, so Daross just finished talking about what DTs do. I'm going to talk about my experience as a designer before and after we added a DT to the team. So a little background, I work on the native mobile apps for property owners. This is where owners can manage their reservations, rates, and other property information. I'm going to talk about what happened before. So about a little over a year ago, the team had 0 designers. And within a span of a month, we went from 0 to 3. So that began our journey of how to figure out how we can fit into the process. So why do we need a DT? Well, collaboration was really easy from the beginning, right? We have a really caring, talented team. The engineers were fantastic, but when we had to compromise, at the time, usually it meant design wasn't happy. This was mostly because of time constraints, polish being at the bottom of the product priorities, and engineering focusing on velocity. There were no time for iterations. Each time we went to kick off development, it was always, what can we do in this time period? What can we push? And what can we just not do? It was a lot like Kramer trying to get a seat on the train. So a little bit about the tools we were using. We were using Envision for flat click-throughs to go between screens, and Zeppelin for static specs. Neither were good at conveying the whole picture. And we can create interaction specs like the one we saw earlier, but they take a really long time to create, and creating animation videos took even longer. And even then, things still get lost in translation. So we started using other tools like Flinto and Principle that popped up recently, which are quicker to create and they feel more real, but they do not take into account tech and code barriers. Take this really cool GIF example I found. There's a lot of fun subtleties here where the button wiggles a little bit and the little icons move out of the way. It's fun, but it also would take a long time to build. And when we were preparing for a user test, creating a Flinto prototype was not fun. Testing on one of these was difficult. We tried other tools, but really no single tool at the time can create a perfect prototype except for real code. And for real, we would often hear a grumble in the studio, look up, and it's always like a designer somewhere doing that to their phone and cursing Flinto. So why do all of these problems matter? Well, the products suffer from lower quality, slower delivery, and higher rework cost, which really is a big waste of time, energy, and money. Like what Daross mentioned earlier, sometimes the animation or interaction that we cut out during implementation is the difference between a user discovering and learning how to use your feature versus not. So what do we do about it? Well, enter Nathan. He was our first iOS design technologist. He was a self-described designer with a CS degree, which is really good DT material because he can see things from the UX perspective, but also in terms of implementation and scalability. He helped in many ways, one of them being the style guide. So one of his first projects was this, and it was our first time working with him, so we figured a style guide is a good place to start. We sent him mocks of elements that we used a lot, like buttons, type, modals. And he sent us builds to our phone very often, and we would give him feedback and iterate. This helped us work through the best interactions for common elements, such as forms, haptics, buttons, controls. Here's an example of a component that went through many iterations. When we first sent Nathan static mocks of this, he came back with the first video. And when we got it and we played with it, we realized that it was kind of weird that whenever you would swipe the screen, the tab would move. You can't really see it here, actually. The tab moves after you swipe. So the first thing we did was we worked with Nathan to get this example on the right, where you swipe and then the tab moves with you. Why is this important? So that we can convey interactability. We want it to feel like you're actually touching and interacting with this app. We don't want it to feel slow or late, and it really improves the experience. So this project ended up being the most useful output of our team, of the DT on our team so far. Why is that? Well, we ended up refining the UI elements for use in our production apps. So that allowed us to share components between all of our other apps for consistency and speed. We're now focused on really drilling into the interactions and animations and visuals of each UI component. We test and iterate until it feels right, then we merge it into our real code base for our engineers to use. We can continue to improve the components based on feedback and testing, and now we can stress the details without pressure to ship specific features. He helped us create a lot of prototypes for features as well, one of them being the welcome guide. The welcome guide is the information a property owner provides to their guests before arrival. This includes information about how to get in, your Wi-Fi password, what to do with the trash. We wanted to make it easy to provide and edit this information on the go. So I'm not going to go through the entire project, but I can show you a few examples of changes we made during prototyping. Let's start with this screen you're looking at now. Imagine trying to find an item like the pool and having to scroll through each category to find it. This looked fun when we were designing it at first and didn't think it would be a big issue, but after getting these builds and trying to use it, we realized that we needed to make it easier. So we went through many versions, but ultimately we landed on a list view like this. Sectioned by critical items you're missing at the top, your guide, the items you already have in there, and what items you can add. So finding an item like the pool would be easier with this alphabetical list or using a search bar at the top. Here's another example. We wanted owners to be able to verify and edit their location. The first version was on the left where you're able to zoom in and move the pin around. But the problem with this one is that you don't know that you moved it. Like you don't know where the original location was. We couldn't revert back, and it wasn't very responsive. So the example on the right is whenever we edited the pin a little bit, but whenever you move the pin around, you get this little reset button on the top right. Tapping on that will move you right back to where it started, and then you can adjust your location from there. So this is important if Google Maps thinks your door is on the back side of your building or you have a different entrance. So user testing. Daross talked a lot about user testing, and our DTs helped us create coded prototypes that included real live inputs, persistent states, and selections that participants interacted with during the test. This created a clearer testing script and an overall better process. We don't hit it 100% the first time, but when things go right, this is literally us in the observation room. Very happy. Well, we worked with Nathan on the design team for a couple of months before we decided to introduce him to our engineering team. We thought this would be a sensitive topic. It's hard to predict the reactions of adding someone new to our process, let alone like a completely new role. But it ended up being very positive. Eventually, they wanted to add him to the engineering team. This was great for us because it allowed us to have better insight into real code environments. What we learned from that was, of course, that some of our assumptions were wrong. Some things are harder to implement in our production apps, but we do know it's not impossible. And we all love him on the team. It's great. What he's currently doing is cleaning up the visuals of our app, updating it to our new style guide. He's doing all this from the engineering team, so it's a little bit faster than when he was on the design team. So long story short, if you zoned out during this whole thing, the main takeaways are that he helped us create quick prototypes for testing and iterations, brainstorming interactions and animations, created reusable code for production, and improved our process in general between designers and engineers. This is us now. Now Daross is going to talk about how to find good DTs.
So hopefully by now, you're at least curious about what DTs could do in your org. Are there any hiring managers here? I'm asking for a friend. So it's critical for the hiring managers to recognize that the skill gap might actually exist in your engineering department, but it's actually not a bad thing. You want to be able to hire engineers without narrowing down this limited labor pool even further by requiring that they also have an eye for design and who also care about design and also have taken the time to learn these skills really deeply. So finding a good candidate for a DT position is, in our experience, fairly difficult. Not because we're awesome, but because it's a new career path. It's just not something that most people have heard of. We probably wouldn't be having this talk otherwise, right? So I myself had never even heard of design technology until a friend of mine referred me to the job. And this just means that networking is really key for this position. Another pro tip, if you're looking for DT candidates, is to look for Flash on their resumes. Because for a long time, particularly for people of a certain age, like myself, this was the only way to really do this kind of work, doing design and development at the same time. Beyond that, there's a few common traits that we look for in design technologists. First one is an eye for design. Anybody can learn design principles. You can read a book on it, right? But in our experience, you can't really teach someone good taste. If your go-to font when you're designing something is Papyrus, maybe this isn't the job for you. So you don't have to be a great designer to be a design technologist. You just have to be able to tell the difference between good design and bad design. So the first thing we look for when we look at DT candidates is their portfolio. It doesn't have to be the best design ever, like I said, but it needs to be executed well and tastefully, and it needs to have airtight attention to detail. If they don't have a portfolio, it's not the end of the world, but it's not really a great sign. I mean, we're talking about being really passionate about user experience, and someone who doesn't have a website at all, it might be a red flag. Second thing is an engineering mindset. So DTs do write a lot of code. We don't write every type of code, we just write a certain specific part of it. So we don't need to be able to write a sorting algorithm. It's more important that a DT is able to solve problems in a systematic way. This means it's actually a pretty good career path for people who don't have a CS degree. Like me, I actually have a liberal arts degree, which makes it amazing that I have a job at all, much less a good job. So it also requires a propensity for teaching yourself new skills without a whole lot of guidance. It's something that we have to do all the time. The third thing is communication skills. You have to be able to talk good and stuff. You need to be able to articulate both design and engineering concepts to audiences that don't natively speak those languages. So in a sense, we're like translators. And it's also about having empathy for developers and designers and the user all at the same time. And keeping the bigger picture in mind. And the bigger picture being, what is the best user experience that we can build with the tools we actually have right now? And the final thing that we look for in DTs is a spirit of adventure. So DTs are going to be making a lot of decisions, learning a lot of new things, constantly improving processes or defining processes that don't exist, and seeing gaps that other people might take for granted and saying, we can do better than that. So part of the role is defining the role. This means it's not really a great career path for people who need a whole lot of structure or rails to tell them what to do. So you have to be creative, not just in what you build, but also in how you build it. So I'll leave you with this thought. Design technology is a frontier. It says here, take off glasses dramatically. And it requires a frontier spirit. Didn't actually say that.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody.